The shrill blaring of the fire alarm pierced through the bustling lobby of Sunshine Tower, sending shockwaves of panic through the crowd of early morning commuters. Amidst the chaos, a lone figure emerged, her manicured nails clutching a half-empty paper cup, the dark liquid inside sloshing dangerously close to the rim. This was Karen, a self-proclaimed regular at the high-end cafe located on the ground floor of the office building. And today, her morning routine had taken an unexpected and explosive turn. It had all started with her usual order, a venti latte, triple shot, extra hot. The kind of drink that could melt the enamel off one's teeth if consumed too quickly. But not for Karen. No, she thrived on the scalding sensation, the searing pain that jolted her senses awake each morning. It was her personal elixir, her way of asserting dominance over the baristas who dared to deliver anything less than perfection. However, on this particular day, the universe seemed to have other plans. As Karen snatched the steaming cup from the counter, her eyes narrowed in disapproval. "This is completely unacceptable," she screeched, her shrill voice cutting through the din of the bustling cafe. "I ordered extra hot, and this is barely lukewarm." The poor barista, a young college student barely out of her teens, cowered under Karen's withering gaze. I'm so sorry, ma'am," she stammered, her hands trembling. "We'll remake it right away, I promise." But Karen was having none of it. "Forget it," she spat, her lips curling in disgust. "I'll just take it as it is and give you a little lesson in customer service." Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the cafe, her designer heels clicking against the polished marble floors. As she made her way to the elevators, she took an indignant sip of the offending liquid, only to be met with a scorching sensation that caused her to yelp in pain. In a moment of sheer panic, Karen's hand instinctively shot out, the scalding coffee arcing through the air before making a direct hit on the fire alarm panel mounted on the wall. The sensors, unable to withstand the sudden influx of heat, immediately triggered the building-wide alert, unleashing a cacophony of wailing sirens and flashing strobe lights. Pandemonium erupted as the lobby descended into chaos, with people scrambling for the exits, some shouting in confusion, others already dialing emergency services. And there, in the center of it all, stood Karen, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and disbelief, her coffee cup still clutched tightly in her hand. As the realization of what she had done slowly sank in, Karen felt the weight of the consequences bearing down on her. Her carefully curated image, her uncompromising sense of entitlement, all of it threatened to crumble around her. In that moment, she knew that her morning had taken an unexpected and explosive turn. The chaos in the lobby was palpable as Karen stood frozen, her mind racing to comprehend the enormity of her actions. All around her, people were scrambling to evacuate the building, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and confusion. In the midst of the pandemonium, Karen's gaze finally landed on the barista, who had rushed out from the cafe, her eyes wide with panic. "Ma'am, you need to evacuate the building immediately," the young woman shouted, her voice barely audible over the deafening blare of the alarm. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. How could she possibly explain her impulsive decision to set off the fire alarm over a lukewarm latte? The realization of her mistake weighed heavily on her, and for once, the usually unflappable Karen was at a loss. Sensing the growing tension, the barista reached out and gently placed a hand on Karen's arm. "Please, you need to leave the building," she pleaded, her tone laced with concern. "The fire department has been called, and we need to clear the area for their arrival." Karen's eyes darted around the lobby, taking in the scene of chaos unfolding before her. She could feel the weight of dozens of panicked stares boring into her, and the thought of facing the consequences of her actions sent a shiver down her spine. Summoning the last vestiges of her composure, Karen straightened her posture and mustered a semblance of her usual bravado. "Well, this is certainly an inconvenience," she said, her voice dripping with forced nonchalance. "I suppose I'll have to cut my morning routine short, but I assure you, this will be addressed." Without another word, she turned and began to make her way towards the exits, her steps quickening as the reality of the situation fully sank in. As she pushed through the throngs of accused, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of trepidation. What would the authorities say? How would her employer react? And more importantly, how would she ever live this down? Karen's usually impeccable facade was beginning to crack, and the cracks were only growing wider with each step she took. The once confident woman was now consumed by a growing sense of dread, the weight of her impulsive actions threatening to overwhelm her. As she emerged onto the bustling street, her eyes instinctively scanned the area for any sign of the fire department or law enforcement. The noose was tightening, and Karen knew that she would have to face the consequences of her actions, whether she was ready or not. The acrid scent of burnt coffee and the cacophony of blaring sirens filled the air as Karen emerged onto the bustling street, her heart pounding in her chest. All around her, a crowd had gathered, their eyes fixed on the towering Sunshine Tower, now engulfed in a flurry of activity as fire engines and police vehicles arrived on the scene. Karen felt a familiar sense of panic creep up her spine. This was not how her morning was supposed to unfold. She was supposed to be sipping her perfectly brewed latte, not standing amidst a sea of gawking onlookers, the weight of her impulsive actions bearing down on her. As the first responders rushed into the building, Karen's eyes darted around, desperately searching for a way to escape the growing spectacle. But it was too late. Her frantic movements had already drawn the attention of a nearby police officer, who quickly approached her, his brow furrowed in suspicion. "Ma'am, are you all right?" the officer asked, his tone laced with concern. "We received a report of a fire alarm being triggered, and I need to ask you a few questions." Karen's mind raced, her carefully crafted veneer of composure crumbling with each passing second. I'm fine," she stammered, her voice betraying her unease. "I was just, leaving the building when the alarm went off." The officer's gaze narrowed as he studied her carefully. "And do you know anything about the cause of the alarm?" he pressed, his tone firm. Karen felt the weight of the officer's scrutiny, the prying eyes of the onlookers burning into her. She had always prided herself on her ability to manipulate situations to her advantage, but in the face of this unexpected crisis, her usual tactics seemed to elude her. I'd, she began, her words faltering as she struggled to formulate a coherent response. But before she could continue, a commotion at the building's entrance drew their attention. A group of firefighters emerged, their faces grim, accompanied by a visibly shaken barista. Karen's heart sank as the young woman's gaze met hers, a flash of recognition flickering across her features. "That's her," the barista cried, pointing an accusatory finger in Karen's direction. "She's the one who set off the alarm." The words hung in the air, a damning indictment that cut through the din of the crowd. Karen felt the color drain from her face as the officer's expression hardened, his hand instinctively moving towards the radio at his belt. In that moment, Karen realized that her carefully constructed facade of control and entitlement had crumbled, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. The consequences of her actions were finally catching up to her, and she knew that she could no longer hide from the truth. As the words of the barista echoed through the chaos, Karen felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon her. The carefully curated mask of composure that she had worn like a second skin for so long was now slipping, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. The police officer's expression hardened as he turned to face Karen, his hand gripping the radio at his belt. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me to the station for some additional questioning," he said, his tone brooking no argument. Karen's mind raced, desperately seeking a way out of this nightmare. She had always prided herself on her ability to manipulate and control any situation, but in the face of this unexpected crisis, her usual tactics seemed to have abandoned her. Mustering what little composure she had left, Karen drew herself up to her full height, attempting to regain a semblance of her former confidence. "Officer, I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding," she said, her voice quivering ever so slightly. "I was simply leaving the building when the alarm went off, and I have no idea what could have caused it." The officer's gaze remained unwavering, his eyes narrowing with skepticism. "That's not what the witness is telling us," he replied, his tone brooking no argument. "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me to the station. We can sort this out there." Karen felt the color drain from her face as the gravity of the situation truly sank in. She had always been able to manipulate her way out of trouble, but this time it seemed that her usual tactics were failing her. The thought of being taken into custody, of having her freedom, her control, stripped away was a nightmare she had never even considered. As the officer reached out to gently guide her towards the waiting police cruiser, Karen's mind raced, desperately searching for a way to escape the impending consequences of her actions. But with the barista's damning testimony and the overwhelming weight of the evidence against her, she knew that her options were rapidly dwindling. Panic began to well up within her, a tightness in her chest that threatened to overwhelm her. She had always been in control, always been the one pulling the strings, but now, she was the one being pulled, the one whose carefully constructed world was unraveling before her very eyes. As she was ushered into the back seat of the police car, Karen's mind whirred with a growing sense of dread. She had always believed that she was above the rules, that the world revolved around her and her desires. But now, the harsh reality of her actions was staring her right in the face, and she had no choice but to confront it. The car pulled away from the scene, and Karen found herself hurtling towards an uncertain future. A future where her sense of entitlement and her disregard for the consequences of her actions would be put to the ultimate test. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the police station's interrogation room cast an unearthly glow over Karen's features as she sat, her fingers drumming nervously on the cold, metal table. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the occasional crackle of a nearby radio. Karen had always prided herself on her ability to remain calm and collected, even in the face of adversity. But as the minutes ticked by, the weight of the situation began to wear her down, chipping away at the carefully constructed facade she had meticulously maintained for so long. The sound of the door creaking open jolted her from her thoughts, and she looked up to see the police officer from earlier entering the room, a manila folder tucked under his arm. His expression was unreadable, his movements measured and deliberate. "Miss Smith," he began, his voice level and devoid of emotion, "I've been reviewing the reports from the incident this morning, and I have a few more questions for you." Karen cleared her throat, her mind racing to formulate a response that would somehow extricate her from this predicament. "Officer, I can assure you that this is all just a simple misunderstanding," she said, her voice betraying a hint of desperation. "I was simply leaving the building when the alarm went off, and I have no idea what could have caused it." The officer's expression remained stoic as he flipped open the folder, his gaze scanning the pages before him. "That's not what the witness statements are telling us," he said, his tone laced with a hint of skepticism. "The barista from the cafe claims that you intentionally set off the alarm after your coffee order was not prepared to your liking." Karen felt a surge of panic rise within her, her carefully crafted veneer of composure beginning to crack. "That's simply not true," she exclaimed, her voice rising in pitch. "I would never do something so reckless and irresponsible. Surely there must be some mistake." The officer's eyes narrowed as he studied her, his expression unreadable. "I'm afraid the evidence suggests otherwise, Miss Smith," he said, his voice calm and measured. "The fire department has confirmed that the alarm was triggered by a sudden increase in temperature, and the surveillance footage from the lobby clearly shows you in the immediate vicinity." Karen's heart sank as the weight of the officer's words sank in. The carefully constructed narrative she had been spinning in her mind began to unravel, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She had always been able to manipulate her way out of difficult situations, but this time, It seemed that her usual tactics were failing her. But that's impossible," she stammered, her composure slipping as the realization of her predicament set in. "I would never do something so reckless and irresponsible. This has to be some kind of mistake." The officer's expression remained impassive as he leaned forward, his gaze locked with hers. "I'm afraid the evidence speaks for itself, Miss Smith," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "You're going to have to come with me to be processed for charges related to false alarm activation and public endangerment." As the officer moved to escort her from the room, Karen felt a wave of panic wash over her. Her carefully constructed world, the one where she had always been in control, was crumbling around her. And the prospect of facing the consequences of her actions was a prospect she had never even considered. With a growing sense of dread, Karen knew that this was a battle she could no longer win. The walls were closing in, and the weight of her own actions was about to catch up with her in a way she had never anticipated. The harsh fluorescent lights of the police station cast an unflattering glow on Karen's face as she sat in the back of the squad car, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back. The familiar thrum of the engine and the rhythmic pulse of the police siren were a jarring contrast to the eerie silence that had enveloped the vehicle. As the car navigated the busy streets, Karen felt a growing sense of panic rise within her. This was not how her day was supposed to unfold. She was supposed to be sipping her overpriced latte, basking in the admiration of the baristas who catered to her every whim. Instead, she found herself in the custody of the very authorities she had so often dismissed as insignificant. The weight of her actions, the sheer magnitude of the consequences she now faced, began to sink in, and Karen felt her carefully constructed facade crumbling. The veneer of control and entitlement that had defined her for so long was unraveling, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. As the car pulled into the parking lot of the local precinct, Karen's heart began to race. The reality of her situation was becoming increasingly clear. She was no longer the untouchable queen of her own domain, but rather a suspect facing serious charges. The thought of having her freedom and her reputation stripped away was a nightmare she had never even considered. The officer beside her opened the door, his expression stern and uncompromising. "Time to go, Miss Smith," he said, his voice devoid of any hint of sympathy. "The lieutenant is waiting to speak with you." Karen hesitated, the panic rising in her chest. "Wait, can't we just talk this out?" she pleaded, her voice tinged with a desperation she had never before allowed to surface. "I'm sure we can come to some kind of understanding." The officer's expression remained unchanged as he gently guided her out of the vehicle and towards the station's entrance. "I'm afraid that's not up to me, ma'am," he said, his tone firm. "You'll have to take that up with the lieutenant." As they passed through the heavy steel doors, the familiar sights and sounds of the police station only served to heighten Karen's sense of unease. The bustling activity, the sharp commands of the officers, the acrid scent of stale coffee. It was all a far cry from the pristine, well-appointed world she had come to know. And with every step she took, Karen felt the weight of her situation grow heavier. The realization that her actions had consequences, that she was no longer immune to the rules that governed the rest of society, was a bitter pill to swallow. As she was led towards the lieutenant's office, Karen could feel the eyes of the other officers upon her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disdain. It was a feeling she was unaccustomed to, and it only served to further erode her already fragile sense of control. With a deep breath, Karen steeled herself for the confrontation that lay ahead. She knew that this was a battle she could no longer win with her usual tactics of manipulation and bluster. The stakes had been raised, and the consequences of her actions were about to be laid bare for all to see. As Karen was ushered into the lieutenant's office, the weight of her predicament seemed to press down on her with each step. The polished wooden desk and neatly organized shelves felt like a stark contrast to the tumultuous state of her own mind. The lieutenant, a seasoned officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, fixed Karen with a penetrating gaze as she took a seat across from him. "Ms. Smith," he began, his voice level and authoritative. "I've been briefed on the incident at Sunshine Tower this morning. Care to explain your side of the story?" Karen felt her heart race, her carefully constructed veneer of composure crumbling under the lieutenant's unwavering scrutiny. "Officer, I can assure you that this is all just a misunderstanding," she said, her voice betraying a hint of desperation. "I was simply leaving the building when the alarm went off, and I have no idea what could have caused it." The lieutenant's brow furrowed as he shifted in his chair, his gaze never leaving Karen's face. "That's not what the witnesses are telling us," he said, his tone laced with a touch of skepticism. "The barista from the cafe claims you deliberately set off the alarm after becoming upset with the temperature of your coffee order." Karen felt a surge of panic rise within her, her mind racing to formulate a response that would somehow extricate her from this predicament. "That's simply not true," she exclaimed, her voice rising in pitch. "I would never do something so reckless and irresponsible. Surely, there must be some mistake." The lieutenant's expression remained impassive as he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "The fire department has confirmed that the alarm was triggered by a sudden increase in temperature, and the surveillance footage clearly shows you in the immediate vicinity," he said, his tone unwavering. "I'm afraid the evidence against you is quite substantial, Ms. Smith." Karen felt the color drain from her face as the weight of the lieutenant's words sank in. The carefully constructed narrative she had been spinning in her mind began to unravel, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She had always been able to manipulate her way out of difficult situations, but this time it seemed that her usual tactics were failing her. "But this is completely unfair," she protested, her voice laced with a mixture of desperation and indignation. "I'm a valued customer, a regular at that cafe. Surely, my word should carry more weight than some minimum wage baristas." The lieutenant's gaze hardened as he fixed Karen with a stern look. "I'm afraid that's not how the law works, Ms. Smith," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "Regardless of your status or perceived importance, you are still subject to the same rules and regulations as everyone else." Karen felt a lump rise in her throat as the gravity of the situation fully sank in. The prospect of facing genuine consequences for her actions, of having her freedom and her reputation stripped away, was a nightmare she had never even considered. As the lieutenant began to outline the charges she would be facing, Karen felt a growing sense of dread wash over her. The walls were closing in, and the weight of her own actions was about to catch up with her in a way she had never anticipated. As the lieutenant's stern voice filled the cramped office, Karen felt the weight of her predicament bear down on her like a heavy cloak. The charges he outlined: false alarm activation, public endangerment, and obstruction of justice, were a far cry from the minor inconvenience she had expected. "Do you have any idea of the gravity of the situation you found yourself in, Miss Smith?" the lieutenant asked, his brow furrowed in a mix of disbelief and disappointment. "Your actions could have put dozens of lives at risk, not to mention the significant disruption and cost to the city's emergency services." Karen felt her throat constrict, the reality of the consequences she now faced finally sinking in. She had always operated under the assumption that her status and wealth could shield her from the consequences of her actions, but now that illusion had been shattered. "But I'm a regular customer," she stammered, grasping at the last vestiges of her entitlement. "Surely there must be some way we can resolve this without any further action." The lieutenant's expression hardened as he fixed Karen with an unwavering gaze. "I'm afraid that's not how the law works, Miss Smith," he said, his tone laced with a hint of disdain. "Your status or perceived importance means nothing when you've blatantly disregarded the safety and well-being of the public." Karen felt a surge of panic rise within her, her carefully constructed facade of control crumbling before her very eyes. "This is completely unacceptable," she exclaimed, her voice shrill and desperate. "I'll have my lawyer here in minutes, and you'll all be sorry you ever crossed me." The lieutenant remained unfazed, his expression unwavering. "I understand that you're accustomed to getting your way, "Miss Smith," he said, his voice dripping with a subtle contempt. "But in this case, the law is quite clear. You'll be facing charges, and there's nothing your lawyer can do to change that." As the gravity of the situation fully sank in, Karen felt a wave of defeat wash over her. For the first time in her life, she was powerless, her privileged status and sense of entitlement stripped away. The thought of facing the consequences of her actions, of having her freedom and reputation on the line, was a humbling and terrifying prospect. As the lieutenant called for the arresting officers, Karen felt a surge of resignation. The world she had once dominated, the one where her every whim was catered to, was now closing in around her. And in the end, the only person responsible for her downfall was the woman who had always believed she was above it all. With a heavy heart, Karen rose from her chair, her head held high in a futile attempt to maintain a shred of her former dignity. As she was led away, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the price she would have to pay for her lifetime entitlement and disregard for the consequences of her actions. The story of Karen's dramatic downfall had come to a close, leaving a lasting impact on all who had witnessed it. The once untouchable woman had finally been brought to her knees, a stark reminder that even the mightiest can fall when their sense of privilege and control is challenged.